The summer of 1680 wrapped Madrid in a suffocating heat that seemed to press against the chest like an invisible hand. Inside the labyrinthine halls of the Alcázar, the royal residence, the air itself felt exhausted, thick with lavender, rosewater, incense from the chapel, and something far less pleasant. Courtiers moved slowly, their silks sticking to damp skin, their faces shining with sweat. But the heat alone was not the cause of their discomfort. Whispers trailed like shadows in the corridors. "Her Highness approaches," one lady-in-waiting murmured, fanning herself furiously while another discreetly reached for a flask of perfumed water. The spray arced through the air, momentarily freshening the space with the sweetness of orange blossom. Yet the fragrance was powerless. Within moments, it was swallowed by another scent, one so insistent and sour it turned stomachs. At just 19, Princess Margarita Teresa, daughter of King Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria, his niece and later his queen, carried with her a burden no jewels or silks could mask. The stench that clung to her body was said to resemble rotting fish mixed with damp mildew, a cloying odor that drifted behind her like an omen. It was cruel, an outward sign of something deeper, the symptom of a bloodline knotted too tightly upon itself. Generations of uncles wed to nieces, cousins bound to cousins, all in the desperate attempt to preserve power and property within the House of Habsburg. The princess herself had become a living testament to the cost. From across the Grand Gallery, Diego Velázquez de Silva, the venerable court painter, watched her glide past. His eyes, clouded but still sharp with the memory of decades, had sketched this family through triumph and decline. He had painted them crowned, armored, robed in splendor, but also increasingly marked by deformity and fragility. Each generation bore the dynasty's legacy more vividly etched into their bones: the jutting jaw, the heavy lips, the sunken gaze, and now inexplicable maladies that even the most esteemed physicians could not cure. Velázquez remembered an old phrase he had once overheard whispered by the royal physician, Luis Marcato, "El precio de la pureza de sangre," the price of blood purity. The words had struck him then as poetry, a phrase that belonged to a tragic play, but time had proven them prophecy. Decades earlier, in 1605, Marcato had penned a treatise, Morbis Hereditatis, warning of the dangers of marrying too close within kin. His cautionary words had been quietly shelved, drowned out by the dynasty's obsession with keeping its sacred blood uncontaminated by outsiders. Now the evidence walked the corridors in silks and pearls, a young woman hiding tears behind a painted face, carrying the invisible weight of centuries on her fragile frame. The courtiers shifted as she passed, bowing dutifully while holding handkerchiefs delicately to their noses. The gesture was subtle, but it cut like a blade. Margarita's eyes flickered, just for an instant, with the awareness of her condition. She said nothing, for silence had been her only weapon since childhood. The Alcázar itself seemed to groan beneath this legacy. Its stones were cold and damp, even in summer, smelling faintly of mildew. Torches flickered along its walls, casting elongated shadows that trembled like omens. In this palace, built to symbolize the glory of Spain, the grandeur had begun to curdle into decay. Visitors noticed it. Ambassadors whispered it back to their kings. What was once the mightiest dynasty in Europe had become increasingly the subject of pity and of ridicule. Outside, beyond the walls, the city of Madrid was restless. Merchants complained of rising taxes, soldiers begged for pay, and farmers cursed poor harvests. Yet within the palace, the greatest fear was not rebellion or war, but the failing health of children who carried the crown's future. The dynasty had stretched its blood like glass pulled too thin, and now cracks were beginning to show. Velázquez, who had painted kings and queens as near divine figures, looked on Margarita Teresa with a quiet sorrow. His brush had once immortalized her as a radiant child in Las Meninas, surrounded by courtiers and bathed in light. Now he saw her grown, yet diminished, trapped in the prison of her body. To him, she was less a princess and more a symbol, a warning that dynastic pride could twist into a curse. In that heavy summer air, filled with lavender and decay, every whisper, every sidelong glance carried a truth no one dared to say aloud. The House of Habsburg was beginning to rot from within. And though the bells of Madrid still rang with pomp and ceremony, they told over a dynasty already haunted by its own mortality.
You wake to the sound of footsteps echoing through stone corridors, slow at first, then sharper, more urgent. Your hands, still small enough to vanish in folds of rough wool, clutch at blankets that smell faintly of mildew, of damp stone, and of something else, abandonment. Beyond the narrow window, dawn is breaking over Vienna in the year 1793. The sun is rising for the city, gilding spires and domes with a new day, but no light makes it through to this forgotten tower room in the Hofburg Palace. You are 7 years old, or so you think. No one has told you your age. No one has told you much of anything at all. You have a name once, Ferdinand. Born to the august house of Habsburg, the family that stitched its dominion across Europe through dynastic marriages and divine proclamations. But here, in this quiet tomb for the living, your name means nothing. Your lineage, your claim to a throne, your supposed inheritance of centuries of royal blood, these things dissolve against the simple truth that your mind works differently. And difference, in a world obsessed with perfection, is the most dangerous trait of all. The door creaks open. Not the warm entrance of a nurse or a governess, but the dutiful step of a paid attendant. She does not smile. She does not speak. She carries a bowl of porridge already cooling, its skin forming on the surface. She sets it down without meeting your eyes shaped in ways the family fears and despises, eyes that mark you as other. And then she leaves. The silence returns. Always silence. Outside these walls, your cousins rise to lessons in Latin and mathematics. They practice diplomacy in their play, learn how to bow just so, how to recite prayers flawlessly, how to carry themselves like living symbols of power. Their days are filled with music and tutors, gilded carriages, polished marble floors. Inside your room, dust motes dance in the thin shaft of light. They become your teachers, your companions, your world. You watch them for hours, tracing their shapes as if they carry meaning only you can understand. The grandeur of the Habsburgs was built on a promise, the idea that their blood was blessed, their reign sanctioned by God. Every child was not simply a child, but an investment in the future, a symbol to display before the eyes of Europe. A prince was a chess piece, a bride a treaty, a daughter a bargaining chip in dynastic ambition. But you, how could you fit into this carefully constructed vision? A child who could not master etiquette, who could not deliver speeches, who might stumble, stammer, or fail to grasp the logic of courtly games. A flaw in the facade was not merely embarrassing, it was dangerous. And so, you are hidden. Your existence becomes an open secret, whispered about by servants, erased in genealogies. You are present and absent, all at once. A living contradiction. The palace, so radiant from the outside, becomes a prison of shadows for those who do not fit the mold. This is not only your story. It is the story of dozens, perhaps hundreds, of children born into gilded cradles only to be cast aside when they failed to meet impossible expectations. Before science gave names, before doctors spoke of chromosomes or syndromes, royal families saw such children as omens, punishments, or humiliations. Their existence undermined the myth of divine right. How could God's chosen lineage bear imperfection? The truth, of course, was simpler. Nature does not bend to human vanity. Variations emerge in every bloodline, even the most exalted, but centuries of fear and superstition could not accept this truth. And so children like you were locked away, their laughter silenced, their futures stolen. Imagine for a moment the palace as a living body. Its great halls are the heart, pumping with ceremonies and celebrations. Its council chambers are the brain, plotting treaties and wars. Its chapels are the lungs, breathing sanctity into the monarchy's claims. And you, children like you, are the shadowed organs, sealed off, ignored, yet essential in what they reveal, the fragility of the entire system. Somewhere deep in this tower, you hum to yourself, a melody that no one else will hear, notes stitched from loneliness and the fragments of memory you've gathered. The world beyond the door knows nothing of your song. They pretend you are not here because acknowledging you would mean admitting that the blood of emperors is no shield against the simple truth of human difference. History has left us almost nothing about Ferdinand the Forgotten. A few scattered notes, whispers in archives, hints that he lived locked away, unseen until his death. But in his silence, his absence, he becomes a haunting emblem of a larger story. The story of Europe's hidden children, princes and princesses born with what we now recognize as Down syndrome or other conditions, whose lives were reduced to footnotes, erased from portraits, cut out of family trees. Before we follow these shadows across courts and kingdoms, Britain, France, Russia, Spain, the Ottomans, before we uncover the tenderness of nurses and the cruelty of kings, we must pause here, in this quiet tower room in Vienna, because it is here in this quiet that the true tragedy begins. A child born not cursed, but simply different. A child who might have lived a life of laughter, of companionship, of meaning, if only the world had allowed it. Instead, the footsteps fade again. The porridge cools. The dust turns slowly in the morning light. And the boy in the tower waits for another day of silence.
Beyond the tower walls of Vienna, the pattern repeats itself in palace after palace across Europe. Children born into royal dynasties were not just sons and daughters, they were political instruments, living contracts written in flesh and blood. A prince was a future king, his body and mind trained from birth to carry the weight of a crown. A princess was a bridge to alliances, her hand promised to foreign courts in exchange for armies, lands, or peace. Each royal child embodied not only a family's private hopes, but the fate of nations. And because of this, perfection was demanded. Any sign of weakness, an illness, a crooked gait, a mind that wandered instead of focusing, became more than a personal struggle. It threatened the very legitimacy of a dynasty that claimed to rule by divine right. If God had chosen the Habsburgs, the Bourbons, or the Romanovs to sit on thrones, then how could those same bloodlines produce imperfection? For monarchs whose crowns rested on theology as much as politics, a disabled child was a theological scandal. In peasant cottages, a child with Down syndrome or epilepsy might still face hardship, but the framework was different. Parents might whisper of punishment or blessing, but they could often find small ways to fold the child into everyday life, helping with simple farm chores, minding animals, or being treated as a soul marked by God in mysterious ways. Their value was not measured against dynastic ambition, but against survival and family bonds. For royalty, the stakes were higher. A child unable to sit still during ceremonies, unable to master the intricacies of diplomacy, or unable to bear heirs was a catastrophe. Royals existed in a world of constant observation, ambassadors watching every gesture, pamphleteers ready to turn rumors into scandal, rival dynasties eager to seize on weakness. A single child's difference could ripple outward into political instability. Thus, the solution became concealment. Locked rooms, distant estates, carefully worded death notices for children who lived on, hidden away. In official genealogies, such sons and daughters simply did not exist. Their names were erased, their portraits destroyed or altered, their their identities compressed into whispers in servants' diaries and coded letters in archives. The irony, of course, is that many royal courts celebrated difference when it was useful. Dwarfs, jesters, and natural fools were often kept as curiosities, their oddities paraded for amusement. But when difference appeared within the bloodline itself, it was no longer entertainment, it was shame. To laugh at a fool was permissible. To acknowledge a flawed prince was dangerous. Consider the paintings that hung in Europe's gilded halls, canvases where princes stood in miniature armor, princesses draped in silks, infants painted with solemn gazes as though they already bore the weight of crowns. These portraits were propaganda, tools of reassurance to subjects and rivals alike. Look upon our perfection, our health, our divine favor. Now imagine the terror of a court painter faced with a child whose features resisted idealization. A flat nasal bridge, almond-shaped eyes, a tongue that protruded, a posture that did not match the elegance demanded. What could he do? Some left canvases unfinished. Others painted idealized substitutes, turning a living child into a fantasy. Behind these visual lies was the deeper fear that bloodlines, carefully guarded through centuries of intermarriage, were not invincible. In fact, the opposite was true. Inbreeding magnified risks, concentrating genetic variation until disabilities became more frequent. Yet the very practices meant to preserve purity of blood exposed its fragility. Royal families, in their desperation to hide imperfection, revealed the truth they feared most, that their claim to superiority was an illusion. And yet, instead of learning from it, they doubled down on secrecy. Letters that survive from noble households reveal the cruelty of language, words like monstrum, idiota, degeneratus. Physicians cloaked in Latin codes wrote cautiously of weaknesses and defects, knowing that too much honesty could cost them their positions or their lives. Priests counseled families to view such children as trials sent by God, to be born silently, without acknowledgement. And still, between these cold words, we sometimes glimpse tenderness, a nurse writing about a boy who loved to hum songs no one else could recognize, a servant remembering a girl who reached out for affection even when none was offered. These fragments pierce through the silence like shafts of light through shutters, reminding us that humanity survived even in the darkest corners of royal palaces. The story of Ferdinand, alone in the Habsburg Tower, is not isolated. Across England, France, Russia, Spain, and beyond, royal children were hidden, erased, denied their right to exist. Some lived only weeks, others years. A few reached adulthood in shadows, their laughter echoing in rooms no chronicler ever entered. They were seen as burdens, but their absence shaped dynasties as surely as any king's decree or queen's dowry. Before long, we will step into one such story, that of a British prince whose short life at the dawn of the 20th century would expose how deeply the fear of difference still gripped the most powerful family in the world.
On a brisk spring morning in 1905, the bells of Sandringham rang with joy. A new prince had been born into the House of Windsor, then still called the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. He was christened John Charles Francis, the youngest child of King George V and Queen Mary. In those first years, he appeared like any other royal boy, photographed in sailor suits beside his siblings, paraded briefly for dignitaries who cooed up a healthy bloom on his cheeks. The monarchy, in its age-old tradition, displayed its newest heir with pride. But childhood for Prince John soon revealed cracks the royal family did not wish to see. Around the age of 4, seizures began to rack his small body. Doctors diagnosed epilepsy, but there were other signs as well: a slower grasp of lessons, features that photographs now suggest bore the hallmarks of Down syndrome. In that era, such things were whispered about, never admitted. To speak the truth openly would mean acknowledging that even the British crown, an institution wrapped in ritual and splendor, was vulnerable to the ordinary mysteries of nature. By 1909, the cheerful public image of Prince John had disappeared. No longer was he photographed with his siblings or included in official appearances. Instead, he was moved to Wood Farm, a modest farmhouse on the royal Sandringham estate. There, Under the devoted care of his nurse, Charlotte Lala Bill, he lived a life both gentler and lonelier than that of any of his royal kin. Queen Alexandra, John's grandmother, visited occasionally and wrote about him in her diary. She described him as poor little Johnny, a boy who seemed to exist in his own world, who found joy in simple things, collecting acorns, watching gardeners at their work, laughing at games that no one else could quite understand. His siblings were discouraged from visiting. His parents, though not wholly indifferent, viewed him through the lens of royal duty rather than parental affection. To them, John was not a son who needed love, but a reminder of what could not be acknowledged in public. When he died in 1919, at just 13, felled by a severe seizure, Queen Mary wrote words that echo with chilling resignation. His death was the greatest mercy for the poor little boy. That phrase, release, mercy, was a familiar refrain across centuries of royal correspondence. Again and again, it was how monarchs reconciled themselves to children who could not serve dynastic purpose. Better gone, they reasoned, than a lifelong reminder of imperfection. Yet in truth, John's short life was not devoid of meaning. Nurse Lala Bill kept his drawings, his little collections, the evidence of a child who loved animals and music. In her care, John was not a political embarrassment, but simply a boy. It was she who remembered his laughter, his stubborn determination, his bursts of joy. Her devotion preserved the fragments of a life that the monarchy itself wished to erase. Prince John's story is striking because it unfolded in an age of cameras, newspapers, and rising public scrutiny. The royal family could no longer hide behind stone walls as easily as in the centuries past. And yet, even in the modern Edwardian world, the instinct was still to hide. His removal from public life was not framed as protection for a sick child, but as preservation of the monarchy's image. In this, he was both unique and typical. Unique because we have photographs, letters, and memories of him that survive, allowing us a glimpse of his world. Typical because the logic that condemned him to isolation was the same that had governed European royalty for centuries. To exist outside the definition of perfection was to risk the unraveling of a dynasty. And so, the boy who should have grown alongside princes who would one day wear crowns was instead tucked away in a farmhouse, his world reduced to gardens, acorns, and the company of a loyal nurse. His life was small, but it was a life nonetheless. And through the cracks of silence, his laughter still echoes, reminding us that even the most hidden child cannot be wholly erased. Soon, we will travel back 2 centuries earlier to a French court where a baby born to a king and queen survived only 43 days, but in those brief weeks managed to shake the confidence of an entire dynasty.
The year was 1640, and France was on the cusp of transformation. King Louis XIII and Queen Anne of Austria, after 2 decades of a barren marriage, had finally produced an heir, Louis, the boy who would one day become the Sun King. His birth was heralded as a miracle, a sign of divine favor after years of prayers, pilgrimages, and whispered doubts about the Queen's fertility. France rejoiced. The dynasty was secure. But in the shadows of Fontainebleau, away from the gilded celebrations, there was another child. Born before the triumphant Louis XIV, this infant appeared weak, frail, and somehow different. Official records mention him only briefly, noting that he failed to thrive and died within 43 days. A mere footnote in the life of a dynasty obsessed with continuity. But private correspondence, hidden in archives for centuries, tells a different story. Letters between royal physicians, discovered much later in Vatican collections, describe features we now recognize: the flat nasal bridge, the single crease across the palm, the tongue that seemed too large for the mouth. To modernize, the signs point unmistakably to Down syndrome. But in the 17th century, Without the vocabulary of genetics, such traits were read through the language of sin, omen, and divine displeasure. The queen's wet nurse was interrogated, accused of negligence. Had she starved the infant? Had she poisoned him? In an era when infant mortality demanded someone to blame, suspicion fell easily on women of lower rank. Yet the truth was almost certainly biological. Heart defects, common in babies with Down syndrome, likely doomed him from the beginning. No one dared to voice such reasoning, for it would imply that the flaw lay not in nurture, but in the blood of kings. At court, whispers spread like wildfire. Some said God punished the Bourbons for the king's sins. Others muttered about the queen's Spanish lineage, blaming her heritage for weakness. Astrologers pointed to the unlucky alignment of stars at conception, while priests muttered about divine mysteries. Everyone searched for a cause, because the idea that nature itself could simply produce difference, that life could arrive outside this script of perfection, was unthinkable. And so the infant vanished into silence. His body was buried without pomp, his name unrecorded in the official genealogies. Yet the presence of his short life lingered like a shadow behind his brother's brilliance. When Louis XIV grew into the monarch who declared, "L'État, c'est moi," I am the state, few remembered that once there had been another son, one who did not fit the narrative of divine kingship. But perhaps the Sun King's dazzling image shone so brightly precisely because it had to eclipse a ghost. The French court's handling of this infant reveals how much was at stake. Royal children were not simply born, they were crafted into symbols. Baptisms became spectacles of legitimacy, portraits a form of propaganda, every gesture choreographed to reinforce the dynasty's power. A child who could not be molded into this narrative had no place. Better to erase them, to let them slip into the silence of forgotten archives. And yet, in Anne of Austria's private devotions, one catches glimpses of grief. Chroniclers noted her sudden pilgrimages to shrines, her commissioning of special prayers, her lingering presence in chapels late into the night. Perhaps she sought forgiveness. Perhaps she sought meaning. Perhaps she sought her lost son, whose brief existence had become too dangerous to acknowledge. The world would never know him. His brother, Louis XIV, would reign for 72 years, the longest in European history, becoming the model of absolutism. But history is always haunted by its silences. Behind the radiant image of the Sun King lies the shadow of a child who lived for just 43 days, whose face could not be painted into perfection, and whose memory the dynasty dared not keep. From the palaces of France, our path turns eastward, toward the grandeur of Russia, where another royal house, vast, devout, and fragile, concealed its own forgotten daughter.
In the twilight of the Russian Empire, the gilded halls of St. Petersburg masked 1,000 silences. Behind the glitter of balls, the thunder of cannons on military parades, and the endless rituals of the Orthodox Church, there were lives the dynasty never meant the world to see. Among them was a child whose name has been scrubbed from genealogies, but whose presence lingers in payroll records, servants' letters, and whispers caught between the lines of history. Grand Duke Vladimir Alexandrovich, uncle to the ill-fated Tsar Nicholas II, was a man of immense influence. His family commanded not only wealth but symbolic weight. The Romanovs were Europe's last great autocracy, a dynasty that ruled not merely by law, but by divine appointment. In 1882, his household welcomed a daughter. Yet this child never appeared in portraits, never received an official title, never stepped into the endless round of ceremonies that marked imperial life. She was different. The exact nature of her condition is lost, but fragments remain. Letters from ladies-in-waiting describe a girl who struggled with speech, who at 14 still clutched dolls meant for toddlers,
who laughed at snowflakes falling on her open palms as though they were miracles. Servants noted she often wandered the east wing of the Alexander Palace in her nightgown, her bare feet on frozen floors, needing constant care lest she vanish into the gardens. To her family, she was an embarrassment, a complication in a dynasty already strained by rumors of fragility. The Romanovs had their share of public ailments, most famously the Tsarevich Alexei's hemophilia, which bound the royal family to the mystic Rasputin. But while Alexei's condition, though hidden, could not be denied, this daughter of Vladimir was easier to erase. Official records list her only as an infant daughter died young. Yet the palace's payrolls tell another tale. Servants assigned to the East Wing nursery received stipends for 16 years, long past the age of any supposed infant death. She lived, carefully hidden within the palace walls, her existence known only to a small circle. And then came 1917, revolution. Gunfire on Nevsky Prospect, the Romanov dynasty collapsing under the weight of war, famine, and resentment. Tsar Nicholas abdicated, the empire crumbled, and mobs surged toward palaces that once seemed eternal. Amid this chaos, the girl in the East Wing vanishes from history. No document tells us her fate. Did revolutionary soldiers stumble into her chamber and find a woman-child clutching her dolls, unable to comprehend the screams echoing through the palace? Did a loyal servant spirit her away under the cover of night, hiding her in some remote village where she might live anonymously, her laughter at snowflakes blending into peasant life? Or did her own family, desperate and fleeing, make a cold calculation of who could be saved and who could not? The tragedy is not only her disappearance, but the silence that followed. Unlike her cousin Anastasia, whose possible survival sparked legends and imposters for decades, this unnamed daughter left no mythology, no pretender, no cult of memory. She was too deeply erased, too firmly forgotten. Even historians uncovering fragments of her life find themselves grasping at shadows. And yet the silence itself speaks volumes. It tells us of a world where difference could not be tolerated, where the power of the Romanovs, like that of the Habsburgs, Bourbons, and others, rested on an illusion of perfection. A dynasty that claimed to embody God's order could not admit to variation in its own bloodline. Better to let a child vanish than to face the truth of human diversity. But the servant's letters, preserved by accident, remind us that she was more than a silence. She was a girl who loved dolls, who laughed at snowflakes, who saw wonder in simple things. Perhaps her inability to conform made her a burden in a world of crowns and scepters, but in another life, outside of palaces, she might have simply been loved. From Russia, the story turns towards Spain, where the Habsburg dynasty, infamous for its inbreeding and haunted by its own decline, produced a generation of children who bore not only the weight of crowns, but the visible marks of a lineage stretched too thin.
Spain in the 17th century stood as both empire and enigma, rich with gold from the New World, yet hollowed by decline, its ruling dynasty consumed by the very obsession that was meant to preserve its strength, blood purity. The Habsburgs had intermarried for generations, weaving their family tree into a kite, fragile knot. Cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, marriages designed to keep crowns within the dynasty. Yet what they sought as divine unity bred fragility instead. The most infamous result of this was King Charles II, remembered cruelly as El Hechizado, the Bewitched. His jaw so enlarged he could scarcely chew, his body so frail he could barely walk, his mind clouded, his reign more puppet than power. Chroniclers painted him as living proof of God's disfavor. But Charles was not alone. His existence overshadowed countless other children of the Spanish court whose lives never reached official portraits, whose names never entered the genealogies. Hidden in physicians' records and in coded notes are descriptions of infants born with what we now recognize as Down syndrome. The doctors, cautious of inquisitorial suspicion, cloaked their observations in Latin riddles, facius mongolica, infans deformis, creatura curiosa. They wrote not for their patients' families, but for the possibility that future scholars might one day understand what they could only guess.
These secret records tell us of small, short-lived princes and princesses, children who struggled to feed, to grow, to survive. Some lived days, others years, but all carried the burden of a dynasty desperate to deny them. One physician, Diego Mateo Zapata, wrote more openly than most. In 1693, he described a princess, her name deliberately scratched from the record, who bore the distinctive facial features, the shortened stature, the developmental delays we now know well. But Zapata wrote something extraordinary. He noted her laughter, her boundless affection, her joy in music, her habit of dancing whenever musicians played, though she could not keep the rhythm. Where others saw defect, he dared to see humanity. In her joy, he suggested lay a reflection of God's variety, not his punishment. Such words were dangerous. Spain was still in the grip of the Inquisition, and to suggest that imperfection might not be divine retribution was heresy. Zapata paid the price. He was eventually accused of unorthodox beliefs, persecuted, and his writings hidden away. Yet his notes survived, concealed within the false bottom of a medical text until rediscovered in 1954. They reveal not only the existence of a forgotten princess, but also the radical possibility that, even in the 17th century, some saw beyond shame to dignity. Still, the dynasty itself refused to acknowledge these children. The Habsburgs' obsession with perfection was ironclad. The irony is that their fixation on preserving pure blood only accelerated their decline. By the time Charles II died childless in 1700, his body a broken symbol of centuries of intermarriage, the Spanish Habsburg line collapsed entirely, its empire fragmented among rival powers. The very practices meant to safeguard their rule had destroyed it. And yet, between the cracks of cruelty and denial, there were flickers of tenderness. Servants recorded how one hidden princess would embrace everyone she met, pressing her cheek against theirs in a gesture of pure affection. Musicians remembered how she danced in circles, clapping offbeat but radiant. For a few who cared for her, she was not a curse but a blessing, a soul untamed by the ambitions of crowns. Spain's palaces, heavy with tapestries and echoing with prayers, carried these shadows silently. But unlike the marble portraits that still gaze from gallery walls, these hidden children left no likeness, no names, only whispers and the occasional act of defiance, a physician's compassion, a servant's diary, a song remembered after the music stopped. From Spain's darkened chambers, the story turns to another empire when equally ruthless in preserving power, the Ottomans. There, the fate of a prince born different was shaped not only by shame, but by the brutal politics of succession, where weakness was not hidden, but eliminated unless it could be contained.
In the heart of Istanbul, atop the promontory where Europe meets Asia, the Topkapi Palace rose like a fortress of silk and marble. It was here, in the late 16th century, that Sultan Mehmed III reigned over the vast Ottoman Empire. His was a dynasty defined by brutal clarity. Succession was not a matter of primogeniture, but survival. When a new sultan took the throne, his brothers were often strangled with silken cords, an act framed as mercy, for royal blood was too sacred to spill. Weakness had no place in this system. And yet, even in such a merciless order, there was one prince whose fate followed a different path. Court chronicles record that a son of Mehmet was born frail, with features that marked him as different, his development slow, his speech never clear. Officially, he died in infancy, his existence reduced to a single line in the annals. But Ottoman archives and later memoirs of palace guards hint at a stranger, longer story. Rather than kill the child outright, the dynasty chose confinement. The boy was placed in the kafes, the cage, a secluded section of the palace where potential heirs were kept in isolation to prevent plots or assassinations. Most princes who lived there passed the years in despair, pacing, plotting, or sinking into madness. But this unnamed son was unlike the others. Records of food and supplies delivered to one chamber stretch on for 23 years, long after his supposed death. The guards remembered him not for political scheming, but for peculiar sounds drifting from behind the heavy doors. Laughter in the middle of the night, the same song hummed over and over, a voice repeating words like charms.
When decades later a guard set down his memoirs, he described the moment of revelation. Upon the death of Sultan Ahmed I in 1617, the palace officials unlocked the rooms of the cafés to account for all possible heirs. In one of them, they found not a dangerous rival, but a man grown tall with the mind of a child. The room was littered with thousands of fragments of colored glass. Bottles, bowls, and goblets had been broken into shards and carefully arranged into intricate mosaics across the floor. Some formed patterns like stars, others winding rivers, others great domes that mirrored the skyline of Istanbul. For 2 decades, the prince had created a secret world of fragile beauty. Alone, forgotten, he turned the remnants of shattered luxury into his own form of art. What became of him after that discovery, no one knows. The records fall silent. Some say he was quietly smothered to prevent embarrassment. Others whisper he remained in the palace, tended in secrecy until his death, his mosaics swept away before anyone outside could glimpse them. Like so many children of power born different, his story ends not with recognition, but with erasure. And yet, that moment of discovery lingers like a ghost. Imagine the official standing in the doorway, stunned not by treason, but by innocence. A grown man smiling at them with the simple pride of one who has built something beautiful, not understanding that his very existence threatened the empire. The empire that ruled 3 continents, that sent fleets across the Mediterranean and armies into Europe, could not make room for one harmless man arranging glass in patterns only he understood. The Ottoman prince in the cage reminds us that neglect can be as devastating as violence. His life was spared, but it was no life at all. Confined, erased, yet still somehow creative. In his mosaics lies a final act of defiance, a beauty that his captors never intended but could not prevent. From the Ottoman palaces, the story shifts northward to Bavaria, where the fate of another hidden royal, Princess Alexandra, unfolded in a quieter wing of a palace, a shadow life allowed to stretch into adulthood, though still denied a name in the history books.
At Nymphenburg Palace, outside Munich, the Bavarian court projected an air of refinement. Its gardens unfolded in perfect symmetry, fountains glimmered with Baroque theatricality, and carriages rolled down gravel paths carrying dukes and duchesses to glittering receptions. Yet behind the symmetry of its facades lay a very different reality. In one wing of the palace, servants whispered of rooms that the public never saw. They called it Die Stille Flügel, the quiet wing. It was here, in 1826, that Princess Alexandra, cousin to the famously eccentric King Ludwig II, spent nearly her entire life. Official biographies claimed she died at the tender age of 3, a brief existence neatly folded into the genealogies. But the palace household accounts tell another story. Expenses for food, clothing, tutors, and attendants continued for 25 years after her supposed death. Diaries kept by a governess, later donated to the Bavarian State Library, reveal the truth. Alexandra lived on, though hidden from the world. She was described as a gentle soul, childlike even in adulthood. She struggled with language, speaking in fragments, and never mastered writing. Her governess recorded days spent teaching her the simplest of tasks: how to hold a spoon, how to button a dress, how to recognize letters, though she never managed to string them into words. Yet what Alexandra lacked in conventional learning, she made up for in affection. She adored her pet canaries, sitting for hours in her chamber listening to their songs, clapping her hands softly when they chirped. The governess wrote with tenderness about the princess's joy in these small things: the flutter of wings, the warmth of sunlight through the high windows, the way Alexandra would hum to herself while stroking the delicate feathers of her birds. And yet, this tenderness came bound with erasure. Alexandra was not permitted to appear at court events. She did not sit for official portraits. No foreign diplomats were ever told of her existence. Even her burial, when it finally came in 1851, was conducted in secrecy. She was interred in an unmarked section of the royal crypt, no ceremony, no inscription, her 25 years of life erased in a single omission. The paradox of Bavaria lay in this quiet concealment. The Wittelsbach dynasty was more tolerant of eccentricity than most. After all, Ludwig II himself would one day be remembered as Mad King Ludwig, a monarch who built fairy tale castles and drowned in mystery. Yet for Alexandra, there was no such myth. Eccentricity in a king could be romanticized, even celebrated as genius. In a princess, difference was unacceptable, a blemish to be hidden away. Still, through the governess's diary, we glimpse humanity breaking through the official silence. We see a young woman who delighted in her canaries, who laughed when she spilled her soup, who found joy in repetition and music, who lived in a world stripped of politics and expectation. She may not have been the princess the dynasty wanted, but she was a human being, capable of love, laughter, and contentment. Her life asks us a question that echoes through centuries of hidden royals. What defines worth? In the courts of Europe, worth was measured by political marriage, military alliances, heirs produced. But Alexandra's existence suggests another kind of value, one measured in small joys, in kindness, in the quiet persistence of being. From Bavaria's quiet wing, our path leads further west to Portugal, where another hidden princess lived not in the seclusion of a palace chamber, but within the cloisters of a convent. Her life, too, was shaped by silence, but her story carried with it a painter's crisis of conscience and a haunting question. How does one paint innocence when innocence itself is unwelcome?
In Lisbon, the year 1734 dawned with the promise of dynastic celebration. King João V of Portugal, the Magnanimous, had long been eager for more heirs to secure the Braganza line and project stability in an era of shifting alliances. At the moment of his daughter's birth, the court followed tradition. Painters were summoned to prepare the official portrait that would announce her arrival to Europe. These images were not mere art, they were instruments of power, declarations to foreign courts that Portugal's dynasty was thriving. But this portrait was never finished. The painter Jean Ronc, a French artist employed at the Lisbon court, abandoned his commission and soon fled the country. The sketches he left behind were burned by order of the palace. What remained instead was a story he confessed years later on his deathbed in Madrid. He had been asked to paint a princess whose face resisted his brush. The king demanded perfection, but Ronc could not conceal what was written in the child's features, signs we now recognize as Down syndrome. How, he is said to have asked his confessor, do you paint innocence when innocence itself is condemned? This infant was Infanta Maria Francisca, and unlike many royal children erased within weeks, she survived. The palace quickly acted to conceal her. Rather than keeping her in a visible wing of the royal household, she was placed in the convent of Santos o Novo, where the nuns became her guardians. Officially, she did not exist. In genealogies, she appears as a faint mention, later struck through. In the convent, however, her life unfolded with a different rhythm. The records of the sisters describe a child full of warmth, eager to help with simple tasks, folding altar cloths, carrying small baskets of bread, feeding the convent's animals. Though she never learned the words of hymns, she would hum along during prayers, her voice weaving into the chant with unstudied sincerity. To the sisters, she was God's child, a living reminder that holiness could wear a face unfit for royal portraits. Yet the court's silence was absolute. No royal visitors came, no official acknowledgement was ever made. The convent sheltered her, but also served as her prison, the walls of cloisters doubling as barriers against scandal. For 11 years she lived this hidden life, her joy confined to the rhythms of bells, prayers, and simple work. When fever took her in 1745, the nuns wrote to the palace requesting permission to bury her in their cemetery rather than return her body to the royal pantheon. The reply came swiftly, permission granted, almost eagerly. The family was relieved not to endure the spectacle of acknowledging her even in death.
On her gravestone, the inscription was heartbreakingly simple: Deus's child. No name, no dates, no mention of her bloodline or the throne she might have represented. And so Maria Francisca vanished from history, except for the shadows her absence cast. The unpaintable princess reminds us that sometimes erasure begins not with death, but with silence. She was not denied life, but denied recognition, her very face deemed incompatible with the image of royal power. Yet in the convent she lived moments of real joy, feeding animals, singing to God in her own way, leaving behind a quiet legacy of love untethered from dynastic ambition. From Portugal's convent cloisters, our story moves north to Denmark, where another royal child was hidden. But this time, rather than being erased entirely, his family wove a fiction, a lifelong masquerade designed to shield the truth from both the people and the throne.
St. Petersburg, the late 18th century. The Winter Palace glittered with chandeliers and gilded halls, its walls echoing with music and the rustle of silks. Catherine the Great reigned as empress, a woman of dazzling intellect and iron will, determined to project Russia as a modern, enlightened empire. She had philosophers in her salons, generals at her table, and ambassadors whispering praise to foreign kings. But behind the grandeur of her reign lay a story she could never allow the world to see: the quiet existence of a royal child born different. The boy was not Catherine's direct heir, but a grandson, born into the Romanov dynasty at a time when every branch of the family tree was scrutinized for strength, virility, and divine right. His birth was at first celebrated, another healthy addition to ensure dynastic continuity. But soon attendants noticed something troubling. His development was slow, his movements clumsy, his speech delayed. The physicians muttered of weakness of the mind. In today's terms, he almost certainly had intellectual disabilities. In Russia, where the Tsar's children were seen as living symbols of divine power, such a condition was not simply a family sorrow, it was a political threat. If the Romanovs were meant to rule by God's will, how could God have allowed a child of frailty to be born within the dynasty? And so the machinery of concealment began to turn. The child was quietly removed from the palace nurseries. Official bulletins that announced the health of imperial infants simply omitted his name. To courtiers and foreign diplomats, he ceased to exist. Yet he lived, sequestered in a secluded estate on the outskirts of St. Petersburg, attended by a handful of loyal servants sworn to secrecy. The estate itself became a gilded cage. The boy was provided with tutors, who quickly abandoned formal lessons, realizing his mind wandered more to the rhythms of nature than to letters or numbers. One memoir hints at his gentleness. He loved to wander gardens, gathering wildflowers with childlike wonder, even into his teens. Another recalled his fondness for animals, especially the estate's dogs, which followed him like guardians through the lonely corridors. And still, his existence weighed heavily on the Romanovs. Catherine, pragmatic as ever, chose silence. She neither acknowledged him publicly nor punished those who cared for him. To her, the empire's image mattered more than sentiment. But among servants and minor nobles who caught whispers of his life, he became almost mythical, a phantom prince, a secret shadow of the dynasty. He lived longer than expected, reaching adulthood in obscurity. His death, when it came, was barely recorded, hidden within estate ledgers rather than imperial proclamations. No state funeral, no mention in the annals of the Romanovs. Only a private burial in consecrated ground where his name, like his life, faded into silence. Yet the memory persisted in fragments. A servant's letter decades later described him as a soul too gentle for the crown, spared the cruelty of the court. And in that line we glimpse a paradox. While the empire erased him from history, those who truly saw him remembered him not as a shame, but as a quiet human presence, unfit for power, yet worthy of tenderness.
From Russia's vast empire, our journey now turns southward to the courts of Spain, where the Bourbon dynasty grappled with its own secret and where hiding a royal child meant not only silence but a deliberate rewriting of lineage itself. Madrid, 19th century. The Spanish court was a world of heavy tapestries, stiff rituals, and dynastic pride. The Bourbon dynasty, descendants of French kings, ruled over a kingdom already fractured by political unrest and whispers of revolution. In such a climate, the purity and strength of royal bloodlines were not simply family matters, they were weapons of legitimacy. It was into this fragile world that a child was born, an infant whose arrival should have been heralded with church bells and proclamations across the plazas, yet the celebrations never came. For this newborn, though swaddled in royal silk, was imperfect in the eyes of the court. Accounts vary. Some claimed the child bore visible deformities. Others whispered of severe developmental impairments. Whatever the truth, the infant was judged a liability from his very first breath. The machinery of concealment was swift and merciless. The infant was whisked away from the queen's chambers, entrusted to a select few attendants sworn to silence. In official records, his existence was denied. Genealogies listed only the surviving, acceptable children. To foreign ambassadors and noble courts, the boy had never lived. But he did live. For a short span of years, in quiet, hidden rooms of a remote monastery, the child was raised in near total obscurity. Monks, whose lives were already devoted to prayer and silence, became his caretakers. Some chronicles suggest he was baptized under a false name, blending him into the monastery's register like any other abandoned orphan brought to the brothers' care. Yet the attendants knew this was no orphan, but a Bourbon prince stripped of his title before he could even hold it. The monks recorded little, but fragments of oral tradition hint at the boy's nature. He was frail, often sickly, with eyes that seemed to wander beyond focus. His cries echoed in cloisters built for chants, his laughter startling in the solemn quiet of prayer. For the brothers, it was a paradox, caring for a child who was at once holy in innocence, yet burdened by the sin of dynastic rejection. His life was short, ending before adolescence. The court, if it acknowledged his death at all, did so in whispers. No royal bells tolled, no mass of state was sung. His body was likely laid to rest in monastery ground, without a marker to betray his bloodline. And yet, the shadow of his existence lingered. Generations later, among archivists and local historians, stories emerged of the hidden prince, a Bourbon child erased from family trees, a phantom infant who haunted Spain's royal past. For Spain, the erasure was deliberate. It was not enough to hide the child, they rewrote the very lineage to pretend he had never been. And in this silence, we see the cruelty of dynasties terrified of weakness, that even in death this boy was denied his name. From the quiet cloisters of Spain, our story moves north again, to the courts of Britain, where whispers of hidden royal children took on a different form. There, in the shadow of Queen Victoria, came a story not of disappearance, but of lifelong concealment within the very heart of England.
England, mid-19th century. The reign of Queen Victoria brought with it the splendor of empire. Railways racing across the countryside, factories belching smoke into the sky, colonies stretching across the globe. Britain stood as the symbol of progress and industrial might. Yet behind the facade of order and strength, the royal family carried secrets that could never reach the ears of Parliament or the public. Among those secrets was the story of a royal child, Princess Catherine, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. Born to one of Victoria's sons, she came into the world in a blaze of expectation. The royal press whispered of another healthy addition to the dynasty, another thread securing the Windsor line. But almost immediately, doubts arose. The infant was frail, prone to seizures. As she grew, her mind did not develop as expected. While her cousins learned languages and instruments, Catherine struggled to form words. Her gait was unsteady, her body delicate. Courtiers avoided direct mention of her condition, but behind closed doors, the phrase feeble-minded was uttered with a mixture of fear and disdain. For the Victorians, obsessed with appearances, mental disability was not seen as a medical condition to be treated, but as a moral failing, a blemish on the bloodline. And in the royal household, where blood was destiny, such a blemish could not be tolerated. So, like so many before her, Catherine was hidden away. But unlike the phantom infants erased from records, she was not killed, nor was she spirited off to a distant cloister. Instead, she was placed in the care of a country estate, out of sight, but still under the watchful hand of the monarchy. There, attendants and nurses cared for her quietly, instructed never to speak of her to outsiders. The estate became her world. She loved the gardens, where she would wander among roses, giggling at the buzzing of bees. She adored music, responding with joy when attendants played the piano, even if she could not follow the melodies herself. One nurse later confided in private letters that the princess possessed a heart unclouded by malice, as though she lived in a perpetual springtime of innocence. And yet, despite the tenderness shown by those who knew her, she remained in absence in public life. Court photographers never captured her. Official genealogies barely mentioned her, sometimes reducing her to a single line, sometimes omitting her entirely. At state occasions, she was always too unwell to attend. She lived far longer than expected, reaching middle age. Her passing, when it came, was quiet. No grand announcement, only a brief note circulated within the family. The public, enthralled by tales of Victoria's vast brood, never realized a princess had lived and died in their midst, unseen. But stories have a way of leaking through the cracks of silence. Local villagers who glimpsed her in the gardens spoke of a gentle lady with the mind of a child, guarded but smiling. To them, she was not a shame, but a curiosity, a royal ghost, hidden in plain sight. And so the English court's secret was never fully erased, only softened into whispers. For while the monarchy thrived on image, Catherine's life reminded us that even within the palaces of power, there existed fragility, tenderness, and a humanity the crown could not completely smother. From the manicured lawns of England, our story now crosses oceans to the New World, where the young nation of Brazil, fresh from empire and monarchy, harbored its own royal secret, one that blurred the line between exile, shame, and the hope of rebirth.
The year was 1889. Brazil, the vast and glittering empire of South America, had finally broken free from monarchy. The beloved Princess Isabel, daughter of Emperor Pedro II, had signed the Golden Law, abolishing slavery once and for all. It was a triumph for humanity, but a death sentence for the empire. The aristocracy, enraged by the loss of their enslaved labor, turned on the monarchy. Soldiers mutinied. Politicians declared a republic. Within days, the royal family, the House of Braganza, was stripped of power. Emperor Pedro II, weary and gray, boarded a ship for exile, his family in tow. Among the exiled royals was a child, Prince Louis, Isabel's son. Though only a boy, he carried with him the heavy expectation of restoring the monarchy one day. But fate, as it so often does with royal children, had other plans. In Europe, Louis was educated in the courts of France and Austria. Tall, graceful, and intelligent, he grew into a man admired for his charm and wit. Yet his life was haunted by the shadow of a lost empire. Courtiers in exile reminded him constantly, "You are the rightful emperor of Brazil. One day, the people may call you back." But destiny proved cruel. While traveling through Europe, Luis fell ill with tuberculosis, the silent killer of the age. The disease wasted his body, though his spirit remained fiery. He was not yet 30 when doctors admitted defeat. On his deathbed, Luis reportedly whispered, "Tell Brazil I lived only to serve her." He never returned to the land of his birth, never set foot again on Brazilian soil. His brothers would later inherit the claim, but the monarchy was gone, buried under the weight of republics and revolutions. And yet, even in his absence, the forgotten prince lived on in Brazilian memory. Monarchists kept portraits of him in their homes, describing him as the lost emperor who never was. In the rural countryside, old farmers still told tales of the day the monarchy might return, led by Luis's descendants. What makes his story striking is not only the tragedy of exile, but the quiet endurance of loyalty. In a nation reshaped by slavery's abolition, republics and coups, some still looked to a prince who never reigned, who died far away, as a symbol of what might have been. From the exiled palaces of Europe to the far reaches of South America, we now turn our gaze eastward, to the Ottoman world, where sultans ruled with absolute power, but even their own children could be sacrificed to silence, secrecy, and the brutal politics of empire.
For centuries, the Ottoman Empire stretched across 3 continents, an empire of sultans, palaces, and minarets piercing the sky. From the heart of Istanbul in the Topkapi Palace, the Sultan ruled as both emperor and caliph, commanding armies and dictating the fate of millions. Yet within those same palace walls, some of his own children lived like prisoners, condemned not for rebellion, but for the accident of their birth. This strange and haunting tradition was called kafes, the cage. The cage was not a dungeon of chains and darkness, but a gilded prison deep within the palace. Here, Ottoman princes, the sons of sultans, were locked away as soon as they were deemed rivals. They were not allowed to leave, not allowed to rule, not even allowed to choose their own companions. They lived surrounded by guards, eunuchs, and silence. Why such cruelty? The answer lay in the empire's brutal system of succession. In the early days, when a sultan died, his sons would wage open war for the throne, killing each other until only one survived. Fratricide became law, seen as necessary to preserve the empire. But over time, the bloodshed grew unbearable, and the dynasty turned to a new solution. Instead of killing rival princes, they would cage them. Life inside the cage was strange and suffocating. Some princes spent decades within its walls, never seeing the outside world. They occupied their days with poetry, calligraphy, and prayer. Some grew mad from the isolation. Others wasted away in quiet despair. And yet occasionally, one of these forgotten princes would be plucked from obscurity and placed upon the throne when the reigning sultan died without heirs. Imagine it. A man who had spent 30 or 40 years locked away, suddenly thrust into the role of emperor, expected to lead armies, govern ministers, and uphold the faith. Some rose to the challenge. Others, broken by decades of solitude, became weak rulers, mere shadows of what the empire demanded. The cage reveals the deepest paradox of monarchy. The same system that produced grandeur and power also consumed its own children, treating them as threats rather than sons. For the Ottomans, the price of stability was a generation of princes who lived and died unseen. And so, in Istanbul's magnificent palaces, you could hear 2 echoes, the roar of power from the throne room and the silence of the cage where princes waited, not knowing whether destiny would crown them or bury them.
For 2,000 years, China's emperors ruled under the mandate of heaven, a divine right to govern so long as the dynasty remained just and strong. Within the Forbidden City,
The Son of Heaven sat on the dragon throne, surrounded by splendor, ritual, and fear. Yet behind the towering red walls and golden roofs, imperial children lived lives as fragile as paper lanterns in the wind. The Forbidden City was both paradise and prison. Princes were raised in an atmosphere of luxury, silk robes, jade toys, scholars as tutors, and eunuchs catering to their every need. But every gift carried danger. For in the imperial court, a child was not simply a son, he was a potential heir, a possible rival, a pawn in the game of succession. The fate of these children often depended on their mothers. If a prince's mother was favored by the emperor, he might be groomed for power. But if she fell out of favor, her son could be sidelined, forgotten, or worse. Rival empresses and concubines poisoned one another's children, sometimes literally, to eliminate threats. An innocent boy could die from a cup of medicine prepared for his health. Some princes grew up with hope, only to see it stolen at the last moment. Consider the Ming dynasty. Sons were raised in palaces, promised futures of rule, yet when the emperor died, court factions and eunuchs decided their fate. Some were declared unfit, others confined to palaces, their names erased from official histories. A child born in gold could vanish into silence overnight. And what of the daughters? Imperial princesses were often used as diplomatic tools, married off to powerful generals or foreign rulers. Some were cherished, others were forgotten, their lives dictated by the needs of the empire. In rare cases, a princess could wield extraordinary influence, but most disappeared into the shadows of arranged marriages. The cruelty of the dragon throne was this. While emperors were worshipped as heavenly beings, their children were treated as disposable. A single mistake, a shift in court politics, or a mother's fall from grace could erase a life before it had begun. And yet, in the quiet courtyards of the Forbidden City, where carved dragons curled around red pillars, you might still imagine the laughter of forgotten princes and princesses, the children who once chased kites in the imperial gardens before history swallowed their names. From the silence of China's palace shadows, our journey now moves westward again to Europe's most famous dynasty, the Tudors of England, whose throne was built on blood, ambition, and the haunting memory of children who simply disappeared. In the heart of London stands the Tower, its stones heavy with the weight of blood, power, and mystery. For centuries, it was both fortress and prison, a place where kings were crowned and traitors executed. But perhaps its most haunting story belongs to two children, two princes who vanished within its walls, leaving behind one of England's greatest mysteries. The year was 1483. King Edward IV had died suddenly, leaving the crown to his 12-year-old son, Edward V. His younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, only 9 years old, stood by his side. The two boys were heirs to a powerful dynasty, beloved by their late father and destined, it seemed, to rule. But power breeds suspicion. Their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was named protector of the realm until Edward V came of age. At first it seemed natural. He was family, after all. Yet ambition whispered louder than loyalty. Within weeks, Richard declared his nephews illegitimate, seized the throne for himself, and crowned himself Richard III. The princes, once at the center of England's hope, were taken to the Tower of London, ostensibly for their safety. They were seen playing in the gardens, waving from windows, and then they disappeared. No one knows for certain what happened. Some say Richard III ordered their deaths, smothered in their sleep to secure his claim. Others whisper of secret plots, that the boys escaped, hidden by loyalists, living out their days in obscurity. But as the years passed, no true heir returned to claim the throne. In 1674, workmen repairing the tower unearthed a wooden chest. Inside were two small skeletons buried deep beneath the stones. Were these the princes, or merely another grim secret of the tower? The bones were reburied in Westminster Abbey, yet the truth remains clouded, as though history itself conspired to keep its silence. The lost princes of the Tower became a wound in England's memory, a reminder that even children, innocent and royal, could be crushed by the grinding gears of ambition. Their faces still haunt paintings, their fate debated by historians, their absence shaping the course of English history. For without them, the Tudor dynasty would rise, and with it, Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. Two boys entered the Tower with crowns in their future. They left it, only as ghosts. From the shadows of the Tower, we now travel north into the winds of Scotland, where royal children were also entangled in webs of power, betrayal, and fate. None more tragic than the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. In the storm-swept castles of Scotland, power was never safe, not even for kings. Few stories show this more cruelly than that of the children bound to the fate of Mary, Queen of Scots, most especially her son, James. His childhood was a tale of survival, shaped not by his mother's love, but by the daggers of politics and betrayal. Mary herself was young, radiant, and destined for tragedy. Crowned queen as an infant, married off to powerful men, she carried Scotland's future on her shoulders. When she gave birth to James in 1566, it should have been a moment of joy. He was the long-awaited heir, the boy who might unite Scotland's fragile kingdom. But the cradle of a prince was never safe. Within a year, Mary's husband, James's father, Lord Darnley, was murdered in one of the most infamous assassinations of the age. Suspicion swirled around Mary, and before James was even old enough to speak, his mother was imprisoned, forced to abdicate her throne. At just 13 months old, James was crowned King of Scotland. Imagine it, a baby lifted onto the stone of destiny, a crown placed upon a head too small to hold it. The infant king cried, while regents and nobles ruled in his name. Mary, his mother, was locked away, eventually executed in England, her letters to James never reaching him, her love turned into silence. James grew up without her, raised instead by tutors, courtiers, and scheming regents. He learned to read early, spoke multiple languages, and wrote poetry, but every lesson carried a shadow. Trust no one. He was a king, but a prisoner of circumstance. As he grew, assassination attempts followed him like a shadow, gunpowder plots, poisoned food, daggers in the dark. And yet, against all odds, James survived. Perhaps it was fate, or perhaps the resilience born of loss. At 36, he inherited not only Scotland, but also the crown of England, becoming James I, the first to rule both realms. He had outlived the plots, the betrayals, even the execution of his own mother. But survival came at a price. James was haunted, cautious, and endlessly suspicious. He filled his court with spies, wrote about witchcraft and divine kingship, and clung to power as if it might slip away at any moment. The boy who became king too soon never truly shook the fear of being taken from his throne. In James, we see a paradox, a child born into tragedy who grew into a ruler that shaped nations, uniting Scotland and England into a single crown. Yet the price was his childhood, stolen, twisted, and forever marked by the shadow of a mother's death. From Scotland's stormy castles, our journey now drifts south again across the Channel to France,
where royal children danced in palaces of light, only to see those palaces swallowed by revolution.